This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
Hi, everyone. Welcome into Bartholomew Town's continuing coverage of the impact of COVID-19 here in Rhode Island. I'm Bill Bartholomew. On this episode, a conversation with Central Falls City Councilor and District 16 state senatorial candidate, Jonathan Acosta. All right, well, let's get right into it. First of all, welcome to the Bartholomew Town Podcast here. And what's fascinating to me about your I've been following your work, first of all, through my coverage and sort of interest in the Wyatt Detention Center and just generally kind of exploring Central Falls over the last few years. Now you're sort of stepping into a statewide profile, running for Senate. You're a part of the Rhode Island Political Cooperative. Can you kind of, I guess, just talk about what your message is and what you're trying to bring to the statewide conversation right now? I mean, we have these two Rhode Islands. The COVID crisis has highlighted it as well as any incident that I can recall ever, where, you know, you have people in South County or Newport County that are experiencing one paradigm. And then on the other hand, folks in the urban core are really pushing the boulder up the hill in a much more significant way. So I guess kind of that was a long way of saying, sort of explain where you're coming from and what you hope to bring to the Senate.
Right, absolutely. So, you know, I'm a little bit of a geek, so I might make some
Excellent
some reading references. But you know, I think what I'm trying to bring is a different type of leadership for Central Falls and Pawtucket to the State House. We tend to think about power as outcome based. You know, what we see, what happens. But theorists on power, particularly folks in the 1970s. This guy by the name of Stephen Lukes, who wrote about a book, short pamphlet, Power, A Radical View, talks about what you don't see. So power is also what doesn't happen. And I think we've historically had a relationship with the state where, you know, we were seen as almost patrons. So you're lucky for what you get and be quiet, don't speak up. You know, we'll negotiate these kind of backroom deals for what we're willing to give Central Falls and Pawtucket. And so you didn't see things like more aggressive representation for our community, things like driver's licenses for undocumented folks, folks really speaking out about school budget cuts, folks publicly addressing the Wyatt. And I think it's time for us to change that. I'm not a quiet guy. I'm pretty outspoken, and I think I represent the needs of the community right now. And so for me, I looked at it as a kind of three-strike drive or motivation for why I got involved. So I've been on the council now 2 terms, and and not in any particular order. You mentioned the Wyatt. So one of the things that did bother me was when stuff started happening at the Wyatt, only our state rep at that time, Representative Maldonado, spoke out. Everyone else was silent. And so that started bugging me. Then when we were supporting a resolution, or rather putting forth a resolution supporting a woman's right to choose at the state level, I personally reached out to my state senator, making sure that we would be supporting and codifying Roe v. Wade in our state legislature. She guaranteed that she would, as long as it didn't go beyond the original Roe v. Wade ruling, and 24 hours later ended up voting against it. Luckily it passed, but that was strike 2. Strike 3 for me was when they announced that they were going to implement budget cuts for our school system in Central Falls, and nobody from our local delegation showed up. Nobody spoke up. And I think, to me, it speaks to this different type of power that's been exercised in Central Falls and Pawtucket, which is you need to come to us in private and not have a kind of public debate about the needs of your community. And I think the days for that are over. We've been walking, we've been demonstrating, we've been showing that we're engaged, and I think folks are ready for someone a little bit more outspoken, who knows how to engage with the power structure as is, and hopefully change it.
Yeah, I've used this example on the podcast over the last year or so, you know, a couple of times. Number one, I grew up in Charlestown and went to Charahoe and then URI. And I was involved I was a soccer referee for like 20 years. And that's how I paid my way through school. So I've had the opportunity to get in to the various communities of the state, we'll say, for forever. I've been refereeing at the Lusitania Club in Central Falls since I was 16, or since before that. My dad would drop me off there. So I've had this at least perspective. But, you know, I can remember, you know, we'd have some game or whatever, basketball game or whatever, and the coach would say, okay, you know, we're playing against Central Falls. Hey, everybody, make sure you keep your eye on your stuff. You know, everybody straight to the bus afterwards. there's always been this negative connotation. It's always been, as you mentioned, sort of like, all right, backroom deals. We'll take care of you, you know, almost treating Central Falls, Pawtucket, certain parts of Providence, Woonsocket as minions. And it's time for that, long past time for that to change, obviously. But I think in order to do so, you need to be especially outspoken. And unfortunately, you have to be able to be passionate, outspoken, but also able to reason with those folks that have no clue about the struggles of the urban core. Do you think you have that in you where you could sit down, and you mentioned driver's licenses? I think of, you know, minority leader in the House side, Blake Filippi, who he was pro DACA, pro driver's licenses. So there are allies, unusual allies. Do you think you can pull the state into your message, I guess?
Absolutely. I mean, look, there's two parts of it. One part is showing folks how mutually co-constituted we really are, and that they're, you know, these things will affect you in the long run. And so I think if you start appealing to that logic, then folks can start buying it. So, you know, for example, one of the things I tell people is, for a long time we were talking about the declining youth age population in Rhode Island. So folks in their young 20s were leaving, but it wasn't just that; is people were having less kids. And those shifts take time to really show their impact. I think the most, you could call it, the most serious implication there was the closing of schools, right? So in Warwick, people were flipping out about the closure of schools, but it was because you had less kids. And so any demographer, anyone who was following kind of population trends and fertility rates, would have been able to tell you, like, hey, by the way, in a few years, in 10 years, in 20 years, there's going to be less kids in these school buildings. And so we're going to need less buildings. Now, where that's not true is in the urban core. And part of it is because immigrants tend to have slightly more kids than native whites. But the reason why that's important and puts us kind of in this together is it's the active, young, slightly close to middle-aged workforce whose income tax props up the services that our seniors benefit from. And so if we don't have enough people educated in good jobs in our workforce paying income taxes, we can't afford the services that we have guaranteed our citizens. And so it is the kids of Central Falls, Pawtucket, Providence, Woonsocket, whose tax income is going to help us fund the services that we're going to get when we retire, that our parents are going to get when they retire, which is much sooner, and that our grandparents are receiving right now. And so we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot by systematically undereducating them, by systematically defunding programs that are aimed at their development. They're all around development, right? So it's not just education, it's also youth sports, which you mentioned being a part of, different clubs and electives and things like music and art. You know, there's no music program in the Central Falls High School. And so we're not only robbing those kids of their future, we're robbing ourselves of our future. And so we need to see kind of how integrated our society really is, how dependent we're going to be on these folks, just as in some ways they're dependent on us. And so I think if we can start having that conversation with folks, they'll see it. The other thing is that, I mean, there's an immediate benefit for you. It doesn't surprise me that much that, you know, the minority leader supported driver's licenses. If there are more undocumented drivers, or really unlicensed drivers, on the road, then your insurance companies are going to charge you more. You know, your premium is going to be higher because they factor that into their equation for how they calculate rates. And so if we can turn and look at insurers and say, hey, listen, we now have driver's licenses for everybody. We have less folks that are more likely to leave in a hit and run type of situation because they're afraid of getting arrested or something like that. And so please, you know, stop eye gouging us on these prices. then we all kind of stand to benefit. And so I think having those conversations and doing so in a way that's not just adversarial. And I'm happy to, you know, kind of get in a boxing ring and spar over some of these things. But the more important way of doing this is to appeal to people's humanity and get them to recognize that, look, we're in this together. And the fact that CF and Pawtucket are some of the communities being hardest hit by COVID, but that we're trying to rush back to open our economy. This is where the workers live. You know, like you don't get a business if your workers are dead. You can't get a product if your workers are sick. And so we need to think about those workers when we're moving forward, and remember that they're a part of our society, and that our survival is contingent on theirs and theirs on ours.
Absolutely. I mean, let's focus in now on COVID. And, there's a far right wing group that their whole campaign here in Rhode Island is, all right, we want our summer back. It's this really childish, nonsensical approach to opening up the economy. Some folks are demanding that we go back to 100%, that the crisis is a hoax, et cetera. I feel like that's a much smaller group of people. I know when I've gone to cover some of the rallies that they've held at the State House, it's been 100 people or so, and there's not really an organization around it. It's sort of just a general, don't give me a microchip, that kind of talk, more New World Order protest than anything like that. But at the same time, we see exactly as you point out, the governor, with the one example being the Equity Council that they've established, which until recently wasn't necessarily representative of many of the communities that are most impacted by the virus right now. I mean, they hadn't rolled out translations beyond American Sign Language and Spanish until like a couple of weeks ago. You've got testing sites that you still need a physician's referral for. Many of the folks that are most impacted right now don't have any sort of physician in their life that they can turn to. So from your perspective, what can be done to, for lack of a better term, get this dialed in CF Pawtucket and really start to get to a point where, the numbers are declining from a scientific perspective, but also it is more realistic to say, all right, let's start opening up the economy comfortably.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think first off, we're already doing that in CF. And so I have to kind of take my hat off to our mayor, our director of health here, which is Dr. Michael Fine, who used to be the director of health of the state. They took a really proactive approach at coordinating services and getting test sites set up. I mean, I think in some ways the state has taken credit for some of that stuff, and they have helped for sure. But really, we were kind of on our own. I mean, it's like the classic both flaw and strength of the federalist system, which is like everybody figures it out. If you succeed, then the centralized government or state will take credit. If you fail, they'll be like, well, you were on your own there. So, but all that to say, I think we're already addressing it and we're working on it. One of the things that I think Dr. Fine is really good and humble about, that I don't know that our government tends to be this way, is recognizing what you don't know. You don't know what you don't know. And in some ways, it's hard to call people out on that. But if you're arrogant about not recognizing it once you are called out and bringing people in, then there's a problem. I think what you just spoke about with the Equity Council and kind of who's on it and how that's changed is about folks calling, the government out and saying, like, look, you don't have the right people at the table. Dr. Fine doesn't speak Spanish fluently. Dr. Fine doesn't speak Portuguese or Portuguese Creole very well. And so as soon as he started trying to mobilize, he started reaching out to people who are part of that community. One of the things I kind of jokingly say about our state's public education policies all the time is, how is it that we're trusting people who never went to public schools, who don't send their kids to public schools, to make policy about public schools? There's a disconnect there. They don't know the experience, and yet they think they have some kind of God-given right to legislate it. And so, I think if once you start recognizing your limitations and start including people who kind of complement those and say, like, hey, look, I might not understand the experience of a worker in Central Falls, but I'm going to talk to a representative of an organization, or I'm going to talk to a straight worker in Central Falls to help me figure that out and to inform my policymaking, then I think you can start having an impact. And so here that's meant, getting on the radio, getting on the news channels that folks in the community watch, speaking to folks from the Cape Verdean Cultural Association and saying, like, hey, how do we get all this stuff translated? Like, what's the most effective way of communicating with folks that are in your community? And that's been a real, I think, kind of grassroots effort, but again, a recognition of what you don't know and how to fix that, how to address that. And that takes time. But I think it shows in a lot of the weaknesses in our state and kind of local institutions that we're not good enough at recognizing that yet.
Definitely. And one thing that's been interesting to me as well is I've been working on some, I guess you would say, action groups on the back end, and Omar Ba, for example, bringing up the point that from the Refugee Dream Center, a lot of the food that is distributed isn't culturally appropriate food to some of these folks. So there's a lot of details to just get people to buy into the messaging, to get people to trust in the institutions themselves, that are somewhat basic steps you could take. I mean, you don't have to, obviously the society does need to be rebuilt in many levels, but something as simple as having culturally appropriate food, translated messages on WhatsApp. For me, I got tested for COVID like a month and a half ago or something like that. And what an operation, with all due respect to the National Guard and the military and so forth. But what an operation. I mean, you pull in, it's like you got checkpoints, I'm putting my license up against the window and my hand's shaking. It's like stressful environment. So there's a lot of just basic changes that can be made to accommodate communities that right now are disenfranchised. Again, that's not going to solve many problems, but it might get some more buy-in, some more trust built. And as you mentioned, if you don't have people who understand that experience on these decision-making boards or bodies, it's almost impossible to get there. And then, folks on Block Island, they're psyched about, they're going to open up Ballards on June 12th. They've got a concert booked, this, that, and the other. And then when I mention that to the governor, WPRO slams me for being a Karen. And it's like, no, who do you think is going to work in the kitchen? Who do you think is going to work on the boats? Who do you think is going to perform the music? Who do you think is going to, not necessarily the owners of that facility, but beyond that, there are folks that are vital parts of that machine that are just being completely overlooked in this process.
Yeah, look, and I want to thank you and other members of the media for pushing some of these kind of you can call them more sensitive topics, but the reality is that it's fucked up, but people have to die in order for other people to take this more seriously, right? And so I often think about how Americans view war, right? And we scaled back the way that the media was allowed to cover war after Vietnam. And that was intentional, right? The United States government realized that once you see the gore, once you see, our own people dying, other people dying, you start losing support for that movement. And so you don't see images of the war in Iraq, of the war in Afghanistan, of the war on terror, the way that you used to see images in Vietnam. We have much better cameras now. And that's not a coincidence, right? And so, getting back to our state issue, right after we opened, they stopped reporting for a few days. And, it's completely conjecture, but I believe part of that was because it was going to make us look bad. And so until folks see the bodies, until folks see the people dying, and they're real people to them, right? I mean, it's why the New York Times is getting so much praise right now for their Sunday coverage, for their Sunday front page, right? Because when you see the names, these are real people. They're not just numbers anymore. It's really jarring, and it takes you aback. And so, I think folks who are pushing for the open, who are thinking we're being too sensitive, once people die, I think they'll have to take it more seriously. But in order to do that, we have to continue to spotlight the deaths, right? Like, you have to show the gore of the war in order to push to end it. And in some ways, this is a war against the virus. This is a war against misinformation. And so folks have to recognize that people are dying, that in Central Falls, we have people dying in their homes because either they were afraid to get tested, they didn't have good information about the test, they were afraid to go to the hospital, they might not have had insurance or what have you. And that stuff isn't getting covered in the media. And you have to ask yourself why. And I think part of it is, you don't want to, I get the not wanting to create a sense of panic, but you do have to have a sense of reality. And I prefer the truth over everything else, right? The truth in the long run will set you free, even if it's uncomfortable. And I think we tend to prefer comfort over truth. And I prefer the truth.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. Authenticity. And going back to just an example of my own experience here, again, I'm not trying to be law enforcement or a snitch or anything like that. I honestly am not. That's not what I'm out to do. I have no interest in doing that. But I was out for a drive like last week or whatever down in Narragansett, and it was all kinds of chaos down there. But then what really struck me is when I came back, I live in Elmwood, and I came back and, I spent a lot of time in Roger Williams Park, and you've got a large police presence, again, not really doing anything, but just circling in an intimidating manner with their lights on, literally 5 or 6 SUVs circling at all times. Just a few minutes down the road in Warwick, I heard the clink of a softball bat, and so let me pull in. There's a parking lot full of cars. A game was going, people in uniform, kids playing, not kids, 16, 17-year-old people playing in a travel softball game. And I'm thinking to myself, man, what a double standard. And if you're going to shut down youth sports by and large, that needs to apply across the state. You can't have, some sectors of privilege allowed to play organized softball, while at Roger Williams Park, if you're tossing a Frisbee around, the group's going to get broken up by the police. So that double standard, and again, I got a ton of pushback for this from a certain portion of the audience, and other people said, "Oh, I totally 100% agree with you. It needs to be consistent." I guess that's the real challenge the governor has right now. She's not an evil person. I don't think she's mean-spirited by and large, or trying to hurt people, but it does seem like she has leaned on commerce by and large more so than, in my opinion anyway, on the statewide health challenges that we're bound to experience as we reopen up. I don't know if you can opine on that right now. You don't have to throw the governor under the bus either. I know you're running for Senate. That might,
So look, that what you just mentioned makes me think of two things. The first is getting back to this, the extreme version is when people die. The less extreme version is when people get sick or when people test positive. And so it made me think of the Bundesliga, right? They try to host a game, 2 teams, no fans. And within 48 hours, several players had tested positive, and the coach of one of the teams had been ordered to quarantine for 2 weeks, right? And so, these are professional leagues who are trying this and haven't been able to pull it off, and who immediately, pulled back. And so I think, folks are going to try pushing the limits. And hopefully if we have good information, good testing, good infrastructure to show them how dangerous that is, they will contract again is one side of this. The other side is something you mentioned about policing. And I think when we think about enforcement, when we think about some of our institutions like police departments, fire departments, schools, I often wonder how much we could change by thinking about who we're bringing into those institutions. So I didn't know this until I was doing some digging back when Providence was looking at the Community Safety Act. But Providence, up until the 1960s, had a residency requirement for a significant percentage of its police force. I think police departments, fire departments, and school departments look very different when they are at least somewhat reflective of the communities that they serve. And I'm not talking about just ethnicity or race or class. But just the fact that it's a neighbor, I think there's a different level of accountability. There's a different level of comfort. The way that folks interact is very different. And we know that the majority of the Providence police force now does not live in Providence. We know that the majority of the school teachers in Providence do not live in Providence. And I think there used to be something similar here in CF that surely continues to be the case in our Central Falls schools. But we had a Councilwoman Stephanie Gonzalez, who wanted to change the face of our police department and our fire department to make them more reflective of our community, and did that by working with them to change some of our hiring and recruitment practices. And now we have a police force that looks a lot more like our community. Many of them grew up here. Many of them grew up and still live here. And so I think, our police force is by no means perfect and is still a work in progress, like all institutions. But I feel much more comfortable with our police department than I do with others. And again, I think it's the residency piece, the where you grew up piece, not just the identity piece. When folks talk about kind of ethno-racial identities and institutions, I grew up in Miami. A lot of our teachers were Latino and Black. That didn't necessarily make them effective because there was still a disconnect between our neighborhoods or our lived experience. And so just looking like someone is not enough. You have to understand their lived experience. And I think that when you live in a community and you work in it, it changes your dynamic with people, because you're going to see them when you're grocery shopping. You're going to see them when you're walking your dog or out on the park. And so you don't want to just have a like authoritarian, almost, the negative type of relationship. You want to work on building something positive.
Couldn't agree more. Absolutely 100% agree. All right, let's wrap it with, sort of, number one, you're a part of the political cooperative, and I've been interested in the co-op since its origin. First it was, Matt Brown's got this progressive group, and I think people have started to realize what it is now, that it's more than just Matt Brown. It's not about Matt Brown, my comment, but just more so that it is an all-encompassing group. Do you feel that there is an appetite for, I guess you would say, in the context of institutionalist politics versus outsider or new ways of thinking politics here in Rhode Island, whether that even outside of just the context of party lines? Do you feel like that you're going to be able to ride that wave, or are you kind of focusing more on your own, or is your own credentials, your own issues, or is it a balance? How, I guess each candidate is, I'm sort of curious about that. How much are you leaning on the co-op for momentum versus, and that notion of just change writ large versus, Jonathan Acosta, Central Falls, here's my body of work. What's that balance like?
Yeah, so homophily is an idea that like people are drawn to each other, right? And I am very against individual candidates. I think that we get too excited over individuals, and it ends up kind of obscuring the practical policy outcomes that we should be expecting of. I say that as a person who, my first election that I was able to vote in was Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. So I got sold on hope and change, and then kind of started getting lost in the water of like what is it that we should be expecting. And so coming into working with this group, one of the things that I made very clear to them is like, we need to be very clear and explicit about our ideas, so that when folks are talking about us, they're not talking about us as individuals. They have to engage in our policy proposals. So you have to explain to me why you think that raising taxes on the top 1%, we're talking about people who make more than $466,000 a year, is a bad idea. That impacts, I would argue, none of the constituents in my community, and yet the way that you frame the discourse and manipulate it is to make us seem as if somehow that's going to adversely affect us. It's not. We only stand to benefit from that in Central Falls and Pawtucket. And so you need to talk about why raising taxes, putting the rate back where it was before, like people were fine with paying this. They would just rather not. and they manipulated our state legislature to get out of that, right? You have to explain to me why healthcare for all isn't good. You have to talk to me about why recreational marijuana is a bad thing. We know that mass incarceration was a failure. We know that people in Central Falls and Pawtucket have criminal records over bullshit. And so, like, why is this a bad idea? You have to tell me why increasing the funding formula for English language learners, having that as part of the formula, increasing the coefficient on urban school districts is a bad idea, right? And so if you guys are willing to do that, and mind you, it's starting to work. Like, people are stealing our ideas. There are people right now in the State House who have proposed bills that were our ideas to begin with. And so the pessimist in me has told the group before, I was like, you know what? I don't care that much about winning as long as our ideas win. If our policies proposals win, then ultimately that's what we needed to get out of this. I wasn't in here to be a career-long politician. I told my opponent when I met with her to tell her that I was going to run against her, I said, look, I can live in a world in which you win. I just prefer one in which I do. And if you at least have to engage with the ideas that I'm putting on the table, then I can walk away knowing that I did something right. And so working together, I think, has been about developing these ideas a bit further, being more specific about what our education policy looks like, because I would love it if when we got in there, day one, we could just propose draft bills and have to debate those draft bills. Right now, like I mentioned at the beginning, the way the power structure works is you don't even see the bills, right? We haven't seen the bills because they're all negotiated ahead of time. I want you to have a public debate. I mean, we're a public body. That's what public governance is about. And so day one, when we go in, I would love to, even if they don't let my bill get to the floor or go to a committee, I would love to just give it to the media. Here is our minimum wage bill. Here is our income tax increase bill. Here is our recreational marijuana bill. Here is our driver's license bill. And now you ask them why they're not letting it go to a vote. Because you have to be held accountable to people. All the power that's exercised right now is in the dark. And so you wonder, like, well, how come they're not talking about this? Well, they are. They're just not talking about it in front of you.
Yeah, the Capriccio Accords, as I say, the restaurant downtown. I mean, that's where a lot of these bills are hammered out. And frankly, it's inaccessible to the average media member even. And look, a lot of the institutionalist media here in Rhode Island, and I don't necessarily mean that in this like hyper negative way or anything like that. A lot of these people are good people that just took a job that pays better than doing your own thing. But that is partially a reason for the fact that this stuff stays in the dark as well, because the concepts aren't explored in the form of a debate in front of the average person. So, you have somebody who doesn't really have an understanding of even recreational marijuana, cannabis at this point. They have no concept of what that means other than, all right, well, yeah, it would help with the $800 million deficit. They wouldn't understand the criminal justice implications or the healthcare implications that go with that necessarily. It's in the dark.
Yeah, so I think being in this group has created this really dope space where we're able to develop some of these ideas further, but also hold each other accountable. So when this is over, some of us will win, hopefully all of us, but if some of us lose, there's still the expectation that you're moving this agenda forward. And being able to hold a group accountable rather than one individual, you can say, well, I lost, I tried, or I won, but now I have to make these concessions. But you agreed that this is what you were going to push forward. And so if you're going to make a concession, address that publicly, right? Like have that conversation public. And that's been, like I said, the whole truth thing is really important to me. And so, but also being able to bounce other ideas. So right now, something that's been really concerning for me is the ballot signature requirement. It's something that I know that the Board of Elections is considering, that the state legislature needs to act on. But at the end of the day, Central Falls is the most hard-hit community. It would be irresponsible for me to go and knock on hundreds of people's homes and potentially spread the virus either to them or get it myself. My opponent is a retiree. Like she could be putting herself at risk because it stipulates you need to be present when you get the signature. And so I think it's beneficial both for incumbents and for us as challengers to eliminate the ballot requirement for this session. And it's something that as a group, I've been able to kind of bring to the table and be like, look, your community might not be hard hit, but mine is. And so are you willing to use your voice to protect the people in my community, to protect me as a fellow candidate, as a fellow member of this group? Absolutely.
Well, that's something we're going to be seeing play out over the summer. And obviously it's going to have to be adjusted at some level. There's no way that they can allow for people to go knock on doors or, there's no events to go stand in. And I've followed a lot of candidates around in 2018. And that's a process that is honestly nobody wants to have to deal with either. It's not. And I mean that there are very few exceptions, in my opinion, where a citizen is really getting engaged and informed in that moment. It's hot. You're at some kind of event. You just want to go to the food truck or whatever it is. And it's a very procedural type of affair anyway. So it's not like, you're cutting off the legs from a legitimate election if you get rid of that phase of it anyway, especially in the midst of COVID-19.
Yeah.
This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
Discover over 200 episodes of the Bartholomew Town Podcast, Rhode Island's podcast of record, on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you like to listen to audio.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.